The airport was buzzing with its usual chaos, announcements echoing, families rushing with strollers, business travelers glued to their phones. In the middle of that ordinary scene, something extraordinary walked quietly through the terminal. A tall army officer, still in full dress uniform, moved with slow, deliberate steps. His polished shoes tapped against the tile floor, his cap tucked under one arm. In his other hand, he carried a hard, black military case. Tucked beneath his arm was a carefully folded American flag, its stars perfectly aligned. The officer's face was stoic, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. This was no ordinary flight. He wasn't just traveling, he was escorting a fallen brother in arms home. The young soldier inside the flag-draped casket had dreams, family, and a future cut short. Now, the officer's duty was to see him safely delivered to his final resting place. As he approached the gate, conversations began to quiet. A few passengers noticed his uniform and the folded flag. They whispered to each other, wondering why such a solemn presence was in the middle of their routine travel day. Some instinctively straightened in their seats, a silent gesture of respect. When the officer reached the gate counter, the airline agent looked up, barely glancing at first. She gave the polite but detached smile of someone used to processing hundreds of travelers each day. "Good afternoon, sir. Boarding hasn't started yet. May I see your ID?" she asked, already clicking through her computer. The officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice with the kind of calm dignity that carried authority without arrogance. "Ma'am, I'm here on military escort duty. I'll need to pre-board in order to ensure proper handling of the remains. The casket is being loaded now." For the first time, the gate agent's eyes lifted fully. She froze for just a moment, her smile fading as she registered the folded flag and the gravity of his words. But then, almost as quickly, she stiffened back into her role, her voice clipped. "I understand, sir, but our policy doesn't allow early boarding unless you're in first class or need extra assistance. You'll have to wait until your group is called." A ripple of discomfort moved through the waiting area. Passengers nearby, who had overheard, looked at each other in disbelief. A murmur spread. Had they heard her correctly? The officer remained composed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show frustration. Instead, he nodded slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the internal conflict between his military discipline and the insult to his duty. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm not asking for a convenience. I'm asking for the honor that this soldier deserves. This is his final journey home." The agent hesitated, her hand hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. But rules, policies, and procedures seemed to matter more to her than compassion in that moment. "I'm sorry, sir. That's not something I can authorize. Please wait until general boarding." The air grew heavier. The families, the businessmen, the solo travelers, everyone had stopped pretending to be busy. Dozens of eyes were now fixed on the scene at the gate. The folded flag seemed to shine brighter under the fluorescent lights, its weight pressing on the conscience of every witness. The officer stood tall, unflinching, but the pain in his expression was undeniable. He had faced combat, hardship, and loss. But somehow, standing here, having to explain why a fallen soldier deserved respect, cut even deeper. And though he said nothing more at that moment, the silence that followed spoke louder than any argument. It was the kind of silence that made even strangers realize they were part of something bigger than themselves, a moment of truth, and a test of dignity. The quiet tension that had filled the gate area now thickened into something heavier. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others set their phones to record, sensing that what was happening was no ordinary travel dispute. The officer stood unwavering, shoulders squared, the folded flag still pressed carefully against his side. His eyes were steady, respectful but firm, as though his entire being was trained for this kind of stand, not against an enemy, but against indifference. The gate agent, flustered, quickly called for her supervisor. Within minutes, a man in a crisp airline blazer arrived. His badge swung slightly on a lanyard as he walked, radiating the practiced authority of someone who had spent years managing customer complaints. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his tone polite but clipped. The agent motioned toward the officer. "He's requesting special boarding, military escort for remains," she whispered, her voice softening on the final word as though saying it aloud made the situation too real. The supervisor nodded slowly, then turned to the officer. "Sir, I understand your request," he began carefully, "but our policy is very strict. Boarding must follow the order we've established. I can't allow exceptions, it sets a precedent." The officer's jaw tightened. His voice was calm, even respectful, but laced with steel. This isn't about precedent, it's about respect. The casket of a fallen soldier is being loaded onto this flight. I am his escort. My duty is to ensure he is treated with honor on his final journey. The supervisor crossed his arms, his expression stiffening. He spoke louder now, as if to reinforce his authority to the watching crowd. Sir, I sympathize, but sympathy doesn't change policy. You'll need to wait until your boarding group is called like everyone else. That word, sympathy, landed like an insult. Murmurs broke out among the waiting passengers. Someone muttered, "Are you kidding me?" Another whispered, "That soldier died for this country, and they're making him wait." Phones lifted higher, capturing the officer's stoic face against the backdrop of airline logos and indifferent employees. The officer inhaled slowly, grounding himself. He had learned to control his temper in war zones, and now he called on that same discipline here. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. You don't understand. This young man gave his life in service to his country. He won't ever walk down this aisle himself. The least we can do is allow me to board first, to ensure he is honored, not treated like cargo. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, but pride and procedure wouldn't let him yield. Sir, I cannot make that exception, he said flatly. And that was the moment the crowd had enough. The silence broke, not with the officer's voice, but with the voice of a passenger, a middle-aged woman seated near the gate. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, and called out. Let him through. For God's sake, let him through. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger as others stood. Some clapped, others shook their heads in disbelief at the airline's stubbornness. The atmosphere shifted from quiet tension to collective outrage. The officer didn't move, but his presence grew larger, steadier. He looked directly at the supervisor, his voice firm now, carrying the weight of both grief and command. I have carried brothers off the battlefield. I have handed folded flags to mothers who never got to see their sons come home alive. I will not let this young man be dishonored because of a rule in your handbook. His words cut through the terminal like a blade. Passengers froze, eyes locked on him, some with tears welling up. A man in a business suit near the front spoke next, his voice sharp. You let families with toddlers board first. You let people who pay extra board first. And you're telling this man, escorting a fallen soldier, that he can't. That's disgraceful. The supervisor's face reddened as dozens of phones pointed in his direction. The officer's voice grew quieter now, almost trembling with restrained emotion. This isn't about me. I'll stand in the back of this plane if I have to. But this soldier, this hero, deserves better. He gave everything, and if you make me wait, then every person here will know you denied him the honor he earned with his life. The silence after his words was profound, almost sacred. People shifted to their feet, one by one, until the entire gate area was standing, an impromptu show of respect for the unseen soldier. The supervisor swallowed hard, his authority collapsing under the weight of collective conscience. The officer, still tall and composed, had not shouted, had not threatened. He had simply spoken the truth, and it was undeniable. The airline staff realized they weren't just enforcing policy anymore. They were standing in the way of honor, and the whole world was watching. The gate had become silent again, only the faint sound of rolling luggage and distant announcements could be heard. The supervisor stood frozen, his jaw clenched, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the crowd of passengers, their cameras pointed at him like dozens of quiet spotlights. The officer didn't move. He stood like a statue of discipline, his polished shoes rooted firmly to the ground, the folded flag pressed tightly to his chest. In that stillness, he seemed larger than the moment itself, a living reminder of sacrifice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor exhaled sharply. He straightened his blazer, forced a tight smile, and cleared his throat. Very well, sir, he said, his voice thin. You may board the aircraft first. The words, though reluctant, carried a sense of surrender. The officer gave a short, respectful nod. Not victory, not triumph, simply acknowledgement. His face remained solemn, his duty unchanged. He turned toward the jet bridge as the gate agent quickly scanned his ticket, her hands trembling slightly, her earlier coldness replaced with shame. As he stepped forward, something remarkable happened. One by one, the passengers in the waiting area rose to their feet. Some placed their hands over their hearts, others stood with bowed heads, and a few even saluted. The clapping began softly, hesitant, respectful, and then grew into a powerful wave of applause. The officer walked slowly down the jet bridge, every step deliberate, every sound of his polished shoes echoing like a drumbeat of honor. Flight attendants at the cabin door stood straighter, their eyes misting with tears. The captain himself stepped out of the cockpit, placing his hand firmly on the officer's shoulder as he passed. Inside the cabin, the passengers who had already boarded grew quiet. Some stood in the aisles, pressing against their seats, clearing a path as though a king were walking among them. But it wasn't for the officer, it was for the soldier he escorted, the unseen presence carried with reverence in his every step. The officer paused briefly in the aisle, closed his eyes, and whispered under his breath. It was not for anyone else to hear, only for the brother in arms he was carrying home. Then he moved to his seat, the flag never leaving his arm, his posture never wavering. And for the rest of the boarding process, the aircraft remained silent, no chatter, no complaints, no rustle of impatience. Only the hum of respect, filling every corner of the plane. Hours later, as the plane touched down, the officer's hands tightened on the folded flag. His chest rose and fell slowly, as though preparing himself for the weight of what came next. When the cabin door opened, passengers didn't rush to unbuckle or grab their bags. Instead, they remained seated, their silence deliberate. The officer was the first to rise. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, the folded flag pressed to his heart, his eyes fixed forward. At the bottom of the jet bridge, the casket awaited. Covered in a flag identical to the one the officer carried, it rested on a military cart. On the tarmac, soldiers in dress uniform stood at rigid attention. The sun caught the edge of the flag, making the red and blue blaze against the gray of the concrete. The officer stepped forward, saluted sharply, and then placed his folded flag atop the casket, his hands trembling just slightly as he did so. The crowd behind him, passengers, flight crew, even airport staff, stood in reverent silence. Not one phone rang, not one suitcase rolled. A woman stepped forward from the gathered family. Her face was pale with grief, her body unsteady. She clutched a photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling in a way he never would again. Her tears fell freely, as she looked at the officer. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The officer's stern composure softened for just a heartbeat. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and saluted again before stepping aside. The family gathered around the casket, their hands resting gently on the flag that covered their son, their brother, their husband. The airline supervisor, who had once stood firm in his rules, now lingered in the shadows, his head bowed, guilt heavy on his shoulders. He had witnessed firsthand how honor outweighed policy, and he knew this moment would follow him for the rest of his career. As the honor guard lifted the casket, the officer fell in step beside them. Together, in perfect rhythm, they carried the fallen soldier toward the waiting hearse. Every step was measured, every movement sacred. The air was heavy with sorrow, but also with pride. And when the soldier's family placed their hands on the casket one last time, the officer stood a step back, his hand raised in final salute. The story of what had happened in that airport, how an airline tried to deny honor and how one man stood unshaken, would spread far beyond that gate, beyond that flight, beyond that runway. It would remind the world that some duties are sacred, that sacrifice must always be honored, and that sometimes, even in the most ordinary places, the extraordinary shines through.